Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of 100 Years in the NFL, a historical journey. I am excited tonight to begin this journey by featuring the first greatest team of all time to win an NFL championship. But before I do that, though, I just wanted to let you know, as my viewers, is that if you have an idea or a story you want me to look into about your favorite NFL team, just be sure to take a look at my Facebook or Twitter account or even my YouTube page and leave a comment underneath, so then that way I can look into it and maybe potentially discuss it here on this 100 Years in the NFL, a historical journey. I'd be certain to look into that as we continue with this very special countdown. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first championship team from the AFC East that we will discuss. And the first team actually that we will talk about is the 1964 Buffalo Bills of the American Football League. But as all of you may know, as Buffalo Bills fans and NFL fans know, that the Buffalo Bills from 1990 to 1993, they of course lost 4 straight Super Bowls. But in the mid-1960s, though, they had a dominant streak from 1964 to 1966 where they won 3 American Football League Eastern Division titles, and they won 2 of them in 1964 and 1965. Their 64 team, though, was better than their 1965 squad, and we're going to delve into it a little bit of the reason of why they were better in 64, as well as how they were different from AFL teams in the 60s. So let's get ahead and get started about this team. The 1964 Bills, they were a much different team than other AFL teams back then. One of the reasons why is the AFL was really more designed as a league rather than defensive, because the San Diego Chargers, Kansas City Chiefs, Houston Oilers, and other teams devised their team to be an offensive attack. The Bills, meanwhile, though, were more of a defensive style team, and it was reflected, by their first head coach, Buster Ramsey, who began his coaching career actually as a defensive coordinator for the Detroit Lions during the 1950s. He led them to, I believe it was 4 NFL championship appearances, and he won 3 of them in 1952, 1953, and in 1957, before getting the first head coaching job of the Buffalo Bills in 1960. And in his first year, he really represented the Buffalo Bills mold by having the AFL's #1 ranked passing defense, and he also set the mark with the fewest yards allowed by any AFL team during that year in 1960, but his team finished with a lackluster 5-8-1 record. And the next year after that wasn't better either, with a 5-8 record. Actually, strike that, 6-8 record in 1961, which ended up him leaving and letting a different coach come in to try his philosophy. And the Bills found their next head coach by the name of Lou Saban, who was the coach of the Boston Patriots at that time in 1961, but he was signed by the Buffalo Bills in 1962 to be their next head coach. And Saban had a journey of a defensive legacy as well, because he was a 4-time AAFC, which is the All-American Football Conference, which was back in the mid-1940s, and he had been a 4-time champion with the Cleveland Browns under their Hall of Fame head coach Paul Brown, and he had a defensive success story that led him to being hired by the Buffalo Bills in 1962. And instantly, the Buffalo Bills started to have success under his new tenure and leadership as well, because he had a dominant stretch as well in 1962, when he actually started to really mold his defensive structure as well, when he led the AFL in 1962 with 36 interceptions and only allowed 10 rushing touchdowns all season long. So that really stressed his emergence onto the Bills defense as well. And he also led the Bills to their first winning record in franchise history at 7-6-1, which he eventually repeated then in 1963 when he led the Bills to their first playoff appearance in '63, but eventually they lost to the Boston Patriots in the 1963 AFL Eastern Division playoff, 26-8. So in '64, though, this was a really big year, though, for Saban to really influence his team. And what I want to do here, actually, is I want to talk to you about a few of the big key players that the Buffalo Bills had on their 1964 squad. So to get started, let's talk about a little bit about their offense that was big to their success in 1964. Let's start out with their starting quarterback, and that turned out to be Jack Kemp, who began his career actually as a backup quarterback in the NFL before he was targeted by the San Diego Chargers when the AFL first came of age in 1960. But after leading the Chargers to 2 straight AFL championships in 1960 and 1961, he became a mid-season waiver pickup by the Buffalo Bills in 1962, which eventually he became their starting quarterback. But he also had a very interesting backup quarterback as well. For Oakland Raiders fans, this name will be really, really interesting to you guys. Jack Kemp's backup happened to be Daryle Lamonica, who was a 24th round draft pick by the Buffalo Bills in 1963 from Notre Dame. So he had a chance to be Jack Kemp's backup for a few years before Oakland ended up signing him before the 1967 season, I believe it was, before they had Daryle Lamonica years until they reached Ken Stabler. But Daryle Lamonica began his career as Jack Kemp's backup. So pretty interesting there. But also, they had a big-time running back as well to get their offense going, and that fullback just happened to be Cookie Gilchrist, who was a CFL star that he began his football career before he was signed by the Buffalo Bills in 1962. But in '62, when he led the Bills to their first winning record, he became the first AFL running back to rush for over 1,000 yards and really set the stage for a really great career as really one of the big-time fullbacks in the 10-year history of the American Football League. But as well as for running backs, you also have to have great receivers. And Jack Kemp and Daryle Lamonica had 2 really good receiving targets for them in 1964, and wide receiver Glenn Bass and wide receiver Albert Dubinion. Glenn Bass, he was a 23rd round draft pick from Eastern Carolina University by the San Diego Chargers in 1961, and then he waived during the preseason, and he signed with Buffalo before the 1961 season began. So they eventually got a good gem from Glenn Bass. Their other wide receiver, Albert Dubinion, he was a 14th round pick by the Cleveland Browns in 1959 from Bluffton College. And here's a little interesting note. Dubinion was the only player drafted and ever played professional football from Bluffton College. So really representing his university very, very well. Also on their offense, they also had a pretty decent blocking and receiving tight end named Ernie Warlick. He was a 1962 undrafted free agent signing by the Buffalo Bills from North Carolina Central, and he was also joined on a very good offensive line for the Buffalo Bills by left tackle Stu Barber, who was a 4th-round pick by the Bills in 1961 from Penn State, and he was also joined by another 1961 draft pick as well in left guard Billy Shaw, who was the only player in American Football League history to be named to the Pro Football Hall of Fame without playing a down in the NFL. He played with the Bills from 1961 to 1969, and he was the 9th overall pick in the AFL draft in 1961. He went to Georgia Tech University as well. So that rounds it out for the Buffalo Bills' key offensive talents that they had in 1964. So looking ahead, though, to their 1964 key players on a defense that was absolutely legit, but you also had to look back onto the players that they had on there. Their first guy who was a really big key to their success was defensive tackle Tom Seastack. He was a 17th round draft pick in the 1962 AFL draft by the Buffalo Bills from McNeese State. And he was also joined behind him by a threesome linebacking core that really set the new mark for the American Football League. One of those linebackers was left outside linebacker John Tracy, who was a fourth-round pick by the NFL's Los Angeles Rams in 1959, and then he was signed as a free agent by the Buffalo Bills in 1962. In the middle linebacker spot was Harry Jacobs. He was an 11th round pick by the Detroit Lions in the 1959 NFL Draft, and then began his NFL career actually signed by the Boston Patriots, and then he was signed by the Buffalo Bills before the 1963 season began. So he spent 3 years in the AFL with Boston before he was signed by Buffalo in 1963. And then on the last linebacker position, their right outside linebacker was Mike Stratton, who recently passed away at the age of 78 years old from a heart condition, I believe it was. So my prayers go out to his family. But he ended up being an original Buffalo Bill, selected in the 13th round in the 1962 AFL Draft out of the University of Tennessee. In the secondary, the Buffalo Bills also had two really good players as well in rookie cornerback Butch Bird, who was a 64 AFL draft pick. He was a fourth-round draft pick, actually, out of Boston University. And behind him at safety, he was joined by George Samies, who was a sixth-round draft pick by the Kansas City Chiefs in the 1963 AFL Draft, but then he was waived and signed by Buffalo before the 1963 season began. So he really helped mold the back end of the Buffalo Bills secondary. But also the Buffalo Bills had a really good special teams unit, as well as a lot of New York Giants fans and Buffalo Bills fans will remember this name in Pete Gogolak, who was the Buffalo Bills kicker in 1964. He was a 12th round draft pick from Cornell University in 1964, and his punter was Paul McGuire, who was an offseason signing by the Buffalo Bills in 1964 after spending his first 3 years in the AFL with the San Diego Chargers, which he won an AFL championship with the Chargers in 1963 before being signed by Buffalo. But also the Buffalo Bills had another gem rookie punt returner, actually, and his name was Haygood Clark. He was an 18th round draft pick in 1964 from the University of Florida. So that goes ahead and that rounds out the players both offensively, defensively, and special teams that the Buffalo Bills really struck gold in 1964. But before I get to their schedule, I just want to be able to point out a few really important statistics that the Buffalo Bills accomplished in 1964 in the American Football League. They had the AFL's number one ranked defense. They were third in passing, first in rushing. They rushed up for over 2,000 yards as a team, which is very impressive. And they scored, I believe it was 25 touchdowns during the 64 AFL season. Well, they had the number one ranked defense in the AFL as well. They were fourth in passing and they were first in rushing. But here's a really interesting statistic for Buffalo Bills fans here. The NFL and the AFL had 14-game schedules devised from 1960 to 1977. In 1978, the NFL eventually made it a 16-game schedule. But during that 18-year span, from 1960 to 1977, the Buffalo Bills set the mark for the fewest rushing yards allowed in a 14-game season. 913 yards is what they allowed. And on top of it all, they only allowed 4 rushing touchdowns all year in 1964, and they did not allow a rushing touchdown after their Week 6 game against the Kansas City Chiefs. So a very impressive streak by the Buffalo Bills in that department as well. But consequently, though, their offense struggled a little bit in keeping the ball to themselves. Actually, they actually ended up with the most turnovers in the American Football League with 52. They led the AFL with 34 interceptions and 18 lost fumbles. So that rounds out the important statistics.
In its first few seasons, the AFL had gained a reputation as a league that depended on gadgets, gimmicks, and wide-open offense. But from the start of their existence, the Buffalo Bills didn't fit the mold of a typical AFL team.
The Bills' first head coach was Buster Ramsey, who came over from the Detroit Lions, where he had been the defensive coordinator. And, his defensive teams at Detroit got into the NFL Championship game several times in the 50s.
The team had many weaknesses we couldn't strengthen.
However, Buster Ramsey didn't make an easy transition to the AFL.
We lost 4 of our 5 preseason games, then 4 of our first 5 regular season contests. I've got some game action sequences over here that will show you better than I can explain what happened. I think you'll understand why I wasn't happy. Kill the lights, Breezy.
The lights went out on Ramsey after 2 straight losing seasons. He was replaced by former Patriots head coach Lou Saban, who instilled his own defensive philosophy in Buffalo.
So we'll go to work and see if we can't set up 2 types of defense, at least 2 different ideas of thinking against Lee and 1 against Blanda.
Lou was a kind of a down-in-the-dirt fundamental coach. It was the kind of team that really would sell well in Buffalo because they were a blue-collar town, so it was a good match in Buffalo and with Lou.
Buffalo Stadium was known as the Rock Pile, and its fans were hardcore.
It's the only place I've ever been to when you walk off after a game, we put our helmets on because you get hit with full beer cans. And I can understand if someone's going to throw an empty bottle or something at you. But this is the only place that they actually threw full beer at you, which is kind of crazy. It was nice, though, because you could, you catch one and have one on the way to the locker room, if you're lucky enough to grab one.
Under Saban, the Bills became as tough as their fans.
They were probably the first team that kind of looked like an NFL team. They were running more than they were passing. Their defense just was overpowering.
The defense included an unknown named Marty Schottenheimer, who was simply grateful for a job in Buffalo.
Just a young guy, happy to be playing professional football, and I got a 2-year no-cut contract. I think it was $24,000 for each of those years. I got a nice signing bonus, $10,000 or something like that, and a new Buick Riviera.
Right now it's time to take a step forward.
Schottenheimer would enjoy a nearly 40-year ride in pro football, including more than 20 as a head coach.
Everything is possible. Together. Hey, let's go. This is football, man. This is why we're out here.
In his playing days, however, life wasn't so easy on the sidelines. Schottenheimer was mainly a special teamer who found it impossible to crack the starting lineup of Buffalo's talented defense.
John Tracy, Mike Stratton, and Harry Jacobs, as a linebacking core, played together for 67 straight games. That's 4 or 5 seasons. Harry Jacobs was called the baby-faced assassin. I guess for obvious reasons. He had a pudgy little face, and he was a hard hitter.
He was not particularly great athlete, but Harry found ways to get things done, and he just ran the whole thing, making all the calls.
Let's go. We got to stop him right here. Nothing. Red! Red! Right! Double wing red! Outside! Outside! Move head up, sis. Outside!
He was really the captain of the ship when it came to the defense in terms of running the show.
Okay, nothing. It's gonna work. We can't have nothing. Let's get those hands up here, baby. It's gonna work. Who's gonna make first tackle, huh? Let's go, baby.
All of us.
Let's make the first one again, baby.
He and I were in very tough competition because I couldn't crack the lineup. Harry understood the game. I went to him because I'm trying to pick his brain.
What did you do against the first wing?
We had thunder on.
Though Schottenheimer's number had changed from 56 to 57, his eagerness to learn from Jacobs remained constant.
Yellow Dog 4?
No, that was 6-1.
Oh, 61.
Defense, all right.
Would you have a blue line against triple flanker?
Yeah.
Which?
Sam.
I want to get some of this information that he's got, because clearly the reason he was in there playing was because of his command of the game and his understanding of how things were to be done.
Nobody scores. Let's go 44 short.
Against Jacobs and the Bills, the AFL's most wide-open offenses were slammed shut. In 1964 and 65, Buffalo gave up the fewest points in the league. During that 2-year span, the Bills went 17 straight games without allowing a rushing touchdown, a pro football record that still stands.
I think it lent itself to the way that Lou Saban wanted to play football. He's going to play defense, and he was going to smack you in the mouth on offense. He was going to run over you.
The runaway vehicle in Saban's offense was number 34, Cookie Gilchrist. And while his runs usually resulted in a crash, he always arrived in style.
He had a huge pink Cadillac, and painted on the front grille backwards was "Looky, looky, here comes Cookie." So in your rearview mirror, you had no doubt who it was. As if people in Buffalo didn't know a 6'5", 250-pound black guy with sunglasses driving a pink Cadillac was Cookie Gilchrist.
In 1962, Gilchrist became the AFL's first 1,000-yard rusher.
Cookie Gilchrist, pound for pound, inch for inch, the greatest all-around football player that I ever played with or watched play.
Cookie enjoyed running the ball straight ahead so that he could get to hit somebody. And it didn't matter if I was in his way or the guy I was supposed to block was in his way. You know, he was going to hit somebody. And some of the hardest licks I've ever gotten were from the backside with Cookie.
I remember a game against the Patriots in which Chuck Shauna went to tackle him, and he ran right over Shauna and knocked him out.
Other defensive guys are kind of gathered around him when Cookie walks right into their huddle and says, "Which one of you motherfuckers is next?"
To go with the AFL's most punishing runner, the Bills' offense also had one of the league's most rugged quarterbacks in Jack Kemp.
He was very tough. He once broke his hand, and while the hand was healing, he had the doctor form it around a football so that when it healed, he would still be able to hold the ball and throw it.
Jack had as strong an arm as I've ever seen. I mean, he used to go out there and stand on 10-yard line and launch one of those things down there, and literally he could hit the goal line and he could throw the ball 90 yards in the air. I've never seen anything like it in my life, certainly before and not since.
Kemp's greatest attribute, however, was a mind that went beyond football.
We referenced to him as the senator. Even at that time, he had a tremendous interest in the political field and most things intellectual. I mean, he was not your typical 1960s football player.
To me, I've always felt that quarterbacking is about 90% mental. That is, there are many football players, many quarterbacks who can throw and carry out the mechanics of quarterbacking, but in the final analysis, the difference between the average quarterbacks and the good ones are the ones that who can handle the mental aspect, that is the audibilizing and the calling of plays.
You know, we knew that Jack was going to be a politician when in the huddle he would call a end sweep and tell us not to take it too far to the left or too far to the right. So he was kind of down the middle. You know, if guys were on a plane playing cards or cutting up, listening to music, you know, Jack was reading some far-out book.
He used to come in the locker room with all these big books, you know, on the politics and conservation. And I can remember Lou Saban, our coach, saying, "Jack, forget those books. Get your mind on football. Let's get with it."
I know there's been a lot of teasing of me that I was more interested in politics or reading the Wall Street Journal than I was in the playbook. But I knew football. I loved it. maybe I didn't have the love of the X's and O's that some people have.
There's a school of thought that if he had ate and slept and lived, breathed football, he might have been a better quarterback. But by the same token, he wouldn't have been as nearly as interesting a person.
But the future congressman didn't always win the vote of the Buffalo fans, who showed strong support for number 12, backup Darryl LaMonica.
West Side Buffalo was for LaMonica, and other parts were for me. And it was a two-quarterback town. And I'd get booed when I went in, and he'd get cheered when he was standing up on the sidelines.
Kemp's first 2 seasons in Buffalo ended with the Bills falling short of the championship game.
In '63, we lost to Boston. We got booed. I went up to Coach Saban, and I said, Coach, next year we're going to win. And you and I are going to come out in the middle of the crowd, and we're going to look at all these people who are booing us today, and, we're going to have our moment in the sun. And don't forget that. I told Coach Saban that.
In 1964, Kemp led the Bills to a 9-0 start. But in Week 10, he found himself in a political firestorm with Cookie Gilchrist.
We were behind, and I was throwing, but he wanted to run. And, we came to loggerheads in the huddle, and you can't have anybody talking in a huddle. So I told him to leave, and he got mad at me and the coach and walked off, stormed off, sat down, wouldn't come back.
Took himself off the game, sent his backup Willie Ross into the game. Lou Saban was livid and wanted to suspend him from the team.
And it was through the ability of Jack Kemp to arbitrate between Gilchrist and the coach that he actually got back on the team.
You could get exasperated with him, but the team knew that we had to have him to go to the championship. A, B, everybody liked him.
Gilchrist returned without missing a game, and in 1964 earned his second AFL rushing title. The star runner helped guide the Bills to the AFL Championship game against the Chargers and running back Keith Lincoln. A year earlier, Lincoln had rushed for more than 200 yards in the 1963 championship game. And now he helped the Chargers to an early 7-0 lead in Buffalo. But fittingly, the Bills' defense changed the course of the game.
Sometimes a singular play like that defines a moment, defines a team, defines a season, and it did all that for Buffalo. And it grew to mythical proportions.
The tackle heard round the world. Keith Lincoln is hit by Mike Stratton, and Lincoln is through for the day.
When Keith went down, it was as though the lifeblood of the whole team had been sucked dry. And we all just started looking up and down at each other, and there was nothing more you could do. He was gone.
With Lincoln out, the Bills overpowered the favored Chargers. The quarterback who had been cut from the NFL, let go by the Chargers, and booed a year earlier by his hometown fans, was now a champion.
I went over to Saban and I said, hey, let's go out in the middle of the field and give everybody the victory salute. And he laughed, and all of a sudden I got picked up on people's shoulders. It was a powerful moment in our lives.
So let's go ahead and just continue taking a look at the 1964 Bills. I'd actually like to go through the Buffalo Bills schedule in 1964 and really single out some players that had some really good games in 1964. So let's go ahead and let's take a look here at their schedule. Week 1, they played the Kansas City Chiefs, and they won 34-17. And wide receivers Glenn Bass and Albert Dubinion, they combined with 11 catches for 182 yards and 3 touchdowns. Week 2 against the Denver Broncos, the Bills won that game 30-13. Fullback Cookie Gilchrist had 92 yards rushing and 2 rushing touchdowns in a big win for the Bills. Week 3, they played against the defending AFL champion San Diego Chargers and blew them out 30-3. Albert Dubinion had another good game in that one, 5 catches for 123 yards and 1 touchdown. Week 4, this is a little bit of an interesting one. They won 23-20 over the Oakland Raiders, but this is interesting of who had the good game. It was Daryl LaMonica, actually, who had the big game against the team that he would eventually play for. LaMonica finished with 164 yards passing, 1 passing touchdown, and 1 rushing touchdown in a big win for the Bills. Week 5, they played the Houston Oilers. 48-17 was the final, with the Bills crushing them. That game, Cookie Gilchrist, Glenn Bass, and Albert Dubinion scored 5 combined touchdowns in a big win for the Buffalo Bills that pushed their record to 5-0. So a really good start for the Buffalo Bills, but it continued the very next week, Week 6, against Kansas City. It was Jack Kemp who was a big part of the Chiefs' 35-22 victory, completing the season sweep over the Chiefs. Kemp threw 256 yards through the air, 4 touchdowns combined. He had 3 passing touchdowns and 1 rushing touchdown. Week 7, the Bills beat the Jets 34-24 that game, and backup running back Bobby Smith and Albert Dubinion combined for 316 total yards and 3 touchdowns. Bobby Smith had 98 yards rushing, and Albert Dubinion took care of the rest with 218 yards receiving. So a big win for the Bills in that one. Week 8, they played the Houston Oilers once again, and they won 24-10 in that one. And it was Bobby Smith and Cookie Gilchrist actually in the Bills' backfield that set the tone with 227 yards rushing and 3 touchdowns in that game. Week 9, the Buffalo Bills played the Jets, and they won that one again. It pushed their record to 9-0. So a great start for the Buffalo Bills in 64. They won that game 20-7. Cookie Gilchrist and Glenn Bass were the big combiners in this game. Bass had 231 yards receiving, and Cookie Gilchrist had 99 yards rushing, and both of them combined for 2 touchdowns and a big win for them. But Week 10 was the Bills' first step back. They lost this game against the Boston Patriots. Final score was 28-36 in favor of Boston, but Jack Kemp had a really impressive game against them with 295 yards passing and 2 touchdowns. Unfortunately, it was their first loss, though. But the following week, actually, in Week 11 actually turned out to be canceled in 1964, so they actually had to remake the game in Week 12 against the San Diego Chargers, which the Bills won that game 27-24 with Cookie Gilchrist and Joe Auer, who was a rookie running back for the Buffalo Bills in their backfield. Both of them combined for 133 yards rushing, and Joe Auer finished with a rushing touchdown and a big win for the Buffalo Bills to push their record to 10-1. The next week after that, though, they would lose to the Oakland Raiders 16-13 in favor of Oakland in that one. But this was a big game for the receiving department for the Buffalo Bills. Ernie Warlick, Albert Dubinion, and Cookie Gilchrist combined for 156 receiving yards, and it was Albert Dubinion who made a receiving touchdown in the Bills' loss. In Week 14, the Buffalo Bills finally put out a good win. They won 30-19 against the Denver Broncos. Daryl LaMonica, Cookie Gilchrist, and Ray Carlton were big contributors in the Bills' rushing department. Ray Carlton was a backup running back, but they combined for 157 yards rushing. LaMonica had 2 rushing touchdowns. Ray Carlton had the other rushing touchdown. But now we go ahead to Week 15 against the Boston Patriots. This turned out to be a big game for the Buffalo Bills. Their mark was 11-2. Boston's mark coming into this game was 10-1. So eventually what would have to happen in this game is that if the Bills had lost, the Boston Patriots actually would have won the title, because the Bills would have finished at 11-3. Boston would have finished at 11-2-1. But fortunately for the Bills, they did win over the Boston Patriots 24-14 in this one, and Jack Kemp once again had a big game as well with 3 combined touchdowns, 1 pass and 2 rushing touchdowns, but also had 286 yards passing to push the Buffalo Bills into their first AFL Championship game. In their first AFL Championship game, though, in 1964, they had to play the San Diego Chargers, who were the defending AFL champions, but they had a missing link, though, in their future Hall of Fame wide receiver, Lance Allworth. He was actually injured in their season finale, and it was all left to basically Keith Lincoln, who was a big-time player for them in 1963, helped them to win the 1963 AFL championship. But midway through the game, though, he suffered a really hard hit from Mike Stratton that basically knocked him out of the game. San Diego just could not recover from there. And for the first time actually all season, with the turnover problem that I talked to you about with the Buffalo Bills leading the AFL with 52 turnovers during the year, they turned the ball over at least one time in each of their regular season games. But finally, in the AFL Championship game in San Diego, they did not even turn the ball over once, and they really centered their offense around the running game. They had 208 combined rushing yards in the AFL Championship game, and both Jack Kemp and backup halfback Ray Carlton scored to win the game for the Buffalo Bills 20-7 to clinch their first AFL championship in 1964, which put an emphasis on really one of the great teams in AFL history, with the Bills finishing with a mark of 13-2, becoming the first AFL team to finish with 13 wins in a season. So to wrap this up a little bit, let's talk about a little bit about the individual statistics about these players. First, starting out with the Bills' dual quarterbacks here. Let's start out with Jack Kemp, who actually finished his season with 2,285 yards passing and 5 rushing touchdowns. But now, here's the real interesting thing about his touchdown to interception ratio. Everybody kind of talks about it nowadays to really kind of develop how you get into the Pro Bowl or MVP quarterbacks, and usually you would want your touchdowns to be higher than your interceptions. Well, Jack Kemp, he actually finished the season with 13 passing touchdowns and 26 interceptions. So his interception to touchdown ratio was actually 2-1 in favor of the interception. So not really the great year for a quarterback in any league, but still Jack Kemp actually finished with an AFL All-Star bid to go to the AFL All-Star game that year. But as a voter for me, I would be a little shaky to do that with a quarterback of a 13 passing touchdown and 26 interception. He would get no Pro Bowl in my book, just to be perfectly clear about that. But his backup, though, Daryle Lamonica, he finished the year with 1,137 yards passing. He had 6 rushing touchdowns as well. He, as a backup role, had also 6 passing touchdowns and 8 interceptions. So it was a good job for Daryle Lamonica to fill in under Jack Kemp to really develop his skills before really becoming the star that he did become with the Oakland Raiders later in the later years of the American Football League and into the National Football League after the AFL and NFL merged in 1970. For their leading rusher, Cookie Gilchrist, he actually became an AFL rushing champion again in 1964, as he did in 1962 when he became the first AFL player to rush for over 1,000 yards. He barely missed it in 1964, rushing for 981 yards, but he did finish the year with 6 rushing touchdowns along with 30 catches for 345 yards. And as I said as well, Bills combined as a team rushed for over 2,000 yards and scored 25 rushing touchdowns. So Kemp, Lamonica, and Cookie Gilchrist were huge for the Bills to have success in the rushing department in 1964. But as for Glenn Bass and Albert Dubinion, they're a fantastic receiving threat, if I might add. Glenn Bass had a really good year, 43 receptions for 897 yards and 7 touchdowns, but he did not, unfortunately, did not receive an AFL All-Star selection. It was actually Dubinion who finished with a bid for an AFL All-Star game. He had 42 receptions for 1,139 yards and scored 10 touchdowns that year. So a really good year for Dubinion to push his bid for an AFL All-Star selection. But as for the Bills' offensive line, they had 3 actually players to receive AFL All-Star selection, starting with their tight end Ernie Warlick, who was an AFL All-Star selection for his great blocking, but also had 23 catches for 478 yards during the regular season. But as for the Bills, two left, their left tackle and their left guard, Stu Barber and Billy Shaw, not only did they get AFL All-Star selections, they were also listed as AFL All-Pro. So a really solid offensive line. When they would shift Ernie Warlick over to the left side to be a left tight end, it would be a constant to run Cookie Gilchrist and most of their running game to the left side of their line, where the big keys were for the Buffalo Bills offense. So that does it for their key offensive guys. Their key defensive guys, of course, was defensive tackle Tom Seastack, who was an AFL All-Pro and All-Star himself as well. He anchored a defense that led the AFL with 50 sacks, only allowed 4 rushing touchdowns all season, like I said earlier, and they also committed the second fewest penalties of any defense in the AFL at that time, with only 54 penalties there. As for the Buffalo Bills linebacker unit, Mike Stratton and those guys really did a big part for them, with Harry Jacobs and John Tracy really helping out forming that great linebacker unit. But it was Mike Stratton who earned an AFL All-Pro and AFL All-Star bid from the AFL voters. But all 3 linebackers had 6 combined interceptions to really help that defense out. But if you really want to talk about a rookie that really set the stage, though, Butch Bird really centered the mold. He actually led the team with 7 interceptions that year on the way to making an AFL All-Star selection, actually returned one of his interceptions for a touchdown during the regular season. And as for his safety counterpart back there in George Sames, he was an AFL All-Pro selection as well, and an AFL All-Star selection with 6 interceptions behind Butch Bird. So to round this out as well, we also have the special teams unit that we have to take a look at. We have Pete Gogolak, who had a pretty good year for a kicker. He finished with 19 of 29 on field goal attempts, and he made 45 of his 46 extra points, and finished the regular season with 102 points scored, which was the second most points in the AFL. And his punter, Paul McGuire, he had 42.7 yards per punt average on 65 punts. He did not make an AFL All-Star selection, though, but his yards per punt average was the second highest in the AFL that year in 1964. Also, the Bills had 2 really good returners as well. They had a backup running back and wide receiver in Ed Rukowski, who was their primary kick returner. He had 21 kick returns, but had a 23.7 yards per return average. But he did have 1 receiving touchdown for the Bills during the regular season, along with 13 catches for 234 yards. And as for their punt returner, Haygood Clark, he led a really solid campaign as a rookie punt returner. He led the AFL with 33 punt returns and had a punt return touchdown in Week 3 against the San Diego Chargers. So a really dominant team by the Buffalo Bills in 1964. Of course, they were more defensive-led than offensive-led, and their offense, of course, had a problem in the turnover department, but they still made it up with really good running. So this 1964 Bills team was a really legitimate AFL team that could really get it done. But how do they fare, though, against the other AFC East teams? You guys will have to find that out later, as well as I will. As our next broadcast, we will delve into the 1968 New York Jets and their incredible run to their upset over the Baltimore Colts in Super Bowl III. We will really delve into their season on my next broadcast. And I hope you guys have a great night. And like I said earlier at the start of my broadcast, if you have an idea or a story that you would like me to do some research into and talk about it here on this series, feel free to check out my Facebook or Twitter account, or even post a comment underneath on one of my YouTube videos that I do post. But once again, I hope you have a great night, everyone, and I hope you guys stay safe during these difficult times.
CBS Sports thanks you for watching this presentation of the National Football League.